love the movie Princess Bride, and one of my favorite lines from Princess Bride is where Enda Montoya goes, when you don't know what's going on, you go back to the beginning. Go back to the beginning. That's what I have tried to do with this metaphysics, this way of understanding, and it's just a way of understanding. As a matter of fact, it's a lot of ways of understanding because I don't subscribe to any single one. But I want us to look at how I defined religion. When we go back to the beginning, religion comes from the root religare, which means to reconnect. And what we're doing with metaphysics is really history on a grand scale. To reconnect, to tell the most accurate story of the past, memory. You know, the Seder meal is not just about remembering, it's about getting inside the memory, the experience. So today, we're going to go to history, but not just history. History as a root aspect of religion itself. What I believe is an emerging religion, a way of seeing the world and who we are. And of course, we can say history is in cahoots with archaeology. They work together, and history is seen both as a humanities and a social science. And there's a big hoop-de-doo between that definition. But what I can say is two things. One is from Santayana. He said, we are, for those of us that do not remember the past, we are condemned to repeat it. And there's Hegel's statement, which is, we learn from history that we don't learn from history. Isn't that something? Boy, are we in a pickle today. Look at the search for the historical Jesus. That actually started very late with Albert Schweitzer. And he came up that Jesus was a deluded apocalyptic. And the historical understanding of Jesus changes every year as we uncover new documents, new understandings of who he was, new ways of seeing the culture that he lived in. So whether it's Jesus or the Buddha or Robert E. Lee, when we look at history, we get to see who we are. And if we don't allow ourselves to be honest with that, then we're not really learning who we are. We are merely creating another false self. So today we're going to history. And I laid it out in kind of a metaphysical cosmic term because I think history is one of those components of the Holy Spirit which has to do with uncovering that, and that we're in a whole new way. And we've talked about the narrative changing and us learning to be more honest, even with those aspects of our historical past that are very painful to deal with and to realize that we are. As one philosopher said, he said that America is so good at messing up and then getting beyond it to the next piece, but we just don't want to have to revisit it. And yet if we don't revisit it, my gosh, how do we ever wake up? So I'm talking about history in a metaphysical sense today. I want to say hey to my cohorts, Mary Ann and Bob. And so, Mary Ann, I'll go with you first when I talk about history in this context. I throw it to you and get your perspective.
Well, you know, I think one of the overarching questions for humanity is, who are we? And why are we here? And in order to understand who we are, we have to understand where we came from, and all of the stories and the myths and the history that brought us to this place, not just personally in our lifetime, but generationally. You know, when you look back at your generational lines and that kind of history and the ideas and the thoughts that form who you are. And I think as we try to get in touch with all of that, we're writing history as we are studying it, because it is being filtered through who we are now. It's being filtered through current events. It's being filtered through new understandings of the way the world works. So I think when I think of history, I think of it as a foundational, fluid part of our unending story. So that's kind of where I go with it.
Well, and I think that that's totally consistent with my understanding. And I want us to see, you said something important, that historians are observers and participants. And that makes it a very interesting kind of point of view on the whole historical context. Bob, I throw it to you.
Yeah, I think Marianne did make a good point that history is not fixed. History is constantly changing as we learn more, as we reinterpret things. I don't know who the person who made the quote, but I've heard it often when referring to history, is that the victors write the histories. And just because something is written down doesn't mean that's the way it really happened. And as we dig, as archaeologists, as new ways of doing history are developed, we see a lot of different things. The massacre in Tulsa 100 years ago. That wasn't in any of the history books until very recently, and probably isn't in very many of them now. But as we learn more, it informs us of where we really came from and why we may have certain attitudes about certain things and certain people that we don't know where they come from until we begin to delve into history. So it's something that happened in the past, but it's something that is totally changing the present.
Yes. And you all make such good points. It's important for us to understand that what's going on with history is the same thing that's going on in science and everything else. We're getting finer and finer gradations of understanding. That's why I say archaeology's in cahoots. What's going on in Tulsa, it's not just historians, it's archaeologists who are helping to find these bodies. You see how it's starting to work, how we're trying to put together an honest narrative. And through the ages, when it comes to looking at a document, we've come up with a number of what are called critical methodologies. There's redaction criticism, there's literary criticism, there's contextual criticism. There's all these critical methodologies that can now be applied to a text for us to understand the culture and the biases of the culture and how they might actually inform that particular text and lead us to a conclusion that is a lot more romantic than perhaps we would like it to be. And I think we've all three said something that's imperative to this, because it gets back to Da Vinci and all the other great scientists. Who are we? How do we look at that? People say you're not really, you don't define yourself by what you think. You define yourself by what you do. What has your life done? What have you done in your life? That tells you who you are. And that's not all true, but it is mostly true. What I learned in ministry is if you want to know someone, look at their calendar and their checkbook. Go ahead, Marianne.
Well, I was going to say the thing that I always keep in mind is the times that we are living in right now. We are writing history. This is going to be written down, and it is going to be studied in 100 years if there are still people on the planet, which, that's still up for grabs. I don't know that yet. But where history is something that we are creating, and it's Oscar Wilde had written, anybody can make history, only a great man can write it. And so once you write it down and you have that kind of a written record that lives on forever, whether or not it was a true record, it was a perception of the time of the writer. And so I think and Bob, I think you alluded to the fact that history is written by the victors. And it's whoever is going to be writing this down, and they're going to be shaping the future. to come based on what we are creating now, which will become the past.
Well, and I want to just say on top of all that the truth wills out, so that Tulsa is coming out, so that there are these pieces that do, we're learning more about Native massacres. We're learning more about Mississippi lynchings, which have not stopped, by the way, than ever before.
Okay.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I was just going to comment a little bit on what Marianne was saying about writing down history. In our lifetime, there's been a really important development, and that is the way the media covers the news. Because not only are they reporting what is going to be viewed as history, but they're also making history. And I'll use Vietnam as an example. It wasn't until embedded reporters started showing what was going on in Vietnam to the general public that the perceptions of what we were doing and why we were there began to change and brought an end to the war. So in a large part, you can say that the media was actually writing history as they were trying to report it.
And before that, it was newspapers. And before that, it was obscure writings. And, Marianne, you brought something up that will our time now be seen as shameful? And I think it will, because we're already seeing ourselves as shameful. You can see it in the forest fires. You can see it in the flooding. You can see it in the droughts. You can see it in over 500,000, 600,000 people died in America because we were negligent and didn't take care of ourselves and didn't listen. And this is part of who we are. And what America is doing right now is waking up to who we are in a much deeper way, it seems to me.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, especially when it comes to the planet and what's going to happen in the future. And I would say it's not just America. I think this is happening all over the world. I think people are, there's definitely this division happening where people are recognizing that we have to change the way that we are doing things. And when you look at history and you look at the things that went wrong, and then you look at the things that went right, we need to right the ship. We need to right our thinking. We need to change the way that we view our place on the planet and in the world and in the universe. I mean, because I think we're on the verge of an intergalactic kind of step. So,
well, we're definitely at an impasse that looks a whole lot like a precipice, and there are a lot of ways we can go right now. Many of them are not healthy, and that's what.
Well, it's all a numbers game. It's I think Mary Ann is a little more optimistic than I am because she sees changes happening and she sees people taking stands for the right reasons and so forth. And I see some of that, but I'm not sure that there's enough of that. And until there's a majority of people who see the danger of climate change, who see the danger of autocracy, who see the danger of many of the things that the paths that we're going down, it's not going to change because there's too much resistance, and we have to change those numbers.
One of the things I'm reading a book called I Alone Can Fix It, and it's about the final year, and I can't remember who said it, but it was somebody who's an academic, and he said, what we're seeing in Trumpism is the death rattle of a part of old America. And I love to see it that way. It doesn't feel that way because it's very loud. And he says it's very loud and it's going to get more violent. This is a cornered badger, if you will. It's interesting that a badger in a corner is probably one of the most dangerous mammals on the planet. and yet it's one of the most gentle with its children. I've always found that nature interesting. And I think we're in a Badger moment. We've got a part of old America, and how we write this narrative is going to be so important. That's why, for me, reading the Philip Ruckers, and I can't remember the woman who wrote this book too, but why that's very important for me is to start understanding the narrative we're in right now and how it continues to move. And it's a dark narrative. I mean, if you listen to Fox News, it's a dark narrative. And they're trying to create a narrative that is not based on what is real, but is based on their intent of power. And now we're into the struggle that's been going on forever and ever. I mean, when Washington got elected, the first thing Thomas Jefferson did was start a newspaper. That was the Fox News of the day against Washington. Most people don't want to hear that about Jefferson, but it's the same old story. It's what did John Quincy Adams Jr. say? Whoever tells the best story wins. And it's not just the victors who get to tell the story anymore, which is very interesting. That's a real switch because the losers' narrative is starting to come out now. I just read.
We have a different definition of victors than we used to.
Good point. Yeah, talk about that, Bob.
Yes.
Well, there's, especially with social media and so forth, what we used to have a battle of ideas in our collective societal memory, and usually we could tell which ideas were winning out, and the ones that lost would kind of fade away. And we thought that happened with Nazism. We thought that happened with, a lot of different white supremacy and so forth. We thought these were ideas that were going to fade away. But now we have this social media where they can reinvigorate themselves, and they can relabel themselves, and they can spread to people who are not really fully aware of what they're buying into. So it's changed the dynamic. Things are happening much quicker in all fronts, but especially with the emergence of ideas that would normally have faded away in the past.
Yeah.
Well, I think what the ideas that are being able to spread like wildfires, and we're talking about the wildfires, where in the past those ideas were contained within groups, right? And then now with honestly, it's a democratization of information, because anybody can publish now. Where in the past there was always a gatekeeper, and there were always people that controlled those narratives unless you were in those smaller groups. Well, now with the internet, anybody can put out any ideas, and they can be spread and be embedded in places. So when people say, do your research, if you go and do some research on the internet, you can find articles buried everywhere to support any point of view.
Yeah.
And they look like they're coming from legitimate places. So it's a lot harder now. People have to be much more discerning, and they have to be able to understand where their moral line is. And I think that's what all this comes back to, is knowing who we are as a person. And I think I started with this. And to know who we are, we have to look at where we came from.
Yeah. And the problem is we don't know who we are. And we keep thinking we do. And we paint ourselves in a romantic sense. And this is the part that's really hard for me. But what you have just lifted up, both of you, is that we are living in a historical time. And I mean that in the sense that each of us are interpreting history and creating it at the same time. And it's not just the gatekeepers, but it's all of us are doing that. There's a cartoon from the New Yorker this week where a husband is sitting at the computer and he's screaming to his wife in the other room, says, "Honey, I found some evidence that the scientists and the historical people have missed about vaccines and why we shouldn't take it." And I think that's why you were saying, Marianne, we can find an obscure piece to justify anything. So who is telling the most accurate account of what truly happened? And now we're into the crux of our time, which is the sorting. We are sorting what is true and what is not. That is a huge mythic piece in our time. The sorting between the truth and what is not true. How do we discern that? And where do we go to get that with some assurance?
We used to be able.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm sorry. We used to be able to count on certain institutions. The Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek magazine, things like that. And now, as Marianne was saying, they're spread into so many different sources. I had a thought about Facebook, which is either the devil or an angel, depending on who you talk to about it. But one thing is clear, 50% of this country gets its news off of Facebook. And
Wow.
Facebook has taken the position that they are an unbiased, they're just the platform. Well, I think that what's going to happen is that some kind of truth panel or truth group is going to have to be instituted in Facebook and in these other platforms. And they're going to have to review what is posted. And they may not censor it, but they may put a stamp on it that says, not true.
And they're already doing that.
Unsupported.
I want to be sure that we see they're already doing that. Marjorie Taylor Greene was kicked off for a week because of her stuff. The next time she'll be kicked off for a month. I think this is her third time or fourth time. They kick them off more and more longer times.
Yeah.
But the companies, the industry is just now waking up to this and seeing that these false narratives in the long run are bad for business. And they're bad for the very fabric that allows their business to exist, which is as a free enterprise. And, these people who say they want to do their freedom, they want to be free to take away my freedom, to take away other people's freedom. And that now we're back to the whole America two ideas, aren't we? So the whole concept of history, and this is my point for this podcast, it is a metaphysical happening. It's when we do metaphysics, when we go into how being came about, how it created life, how life created consciousness, when we do all of that, history is the way it is up close and personal. And Marianne, you brought this up at the beginning. It's a way we look at who we are. And we keep thinking, I keep thinking I know who I am, and then I hear a narrative about, as a Confederate boy, that makes me so ashamed to even say I'm a Confederate boy in ways that I had never even imagined before. That is the role of history, and that's why I believe history is a religious and spiritual event that is called to change us in the name of what is whole and healthy. So don't settle on thinking you know who you are, even if you're looking at those Taoist sites that talk about. Well, I'm getting feedback. These Taoist sites who are just putting out romantic stuff of how wonderful you are and everything else. And that's not to say you're not, but you're also not wonderful. And if you look at each of our histories, we'll see personally that we're all booger butts.
What?
We all have an internal little child, and when we get hungry and tired, that child comes out in ways that are not healthy and whole. And to be able to be honest with that is part of how we become more healthy and whole, which is an interesting paradox. We're coming to the end of our time again. We have had some technical difficulties. I apologize for that, freezing up, and had to stop it here and change our mode a little bit. But we're coming to the end of history. Marianne, final comments?
Well, I love that. We're coming to the end of history. So
I did not mean that in an apocalyptic way.
We have touched on so many things, and there are so many different places that we can go with this. But one of the things that we're talking about knowing who we are, but I think you're right. We don't know who we are, but I think what we need to look at is, who do we want to be? And I think history can give us some insight into how we want to live our lives. And I just recently read the book Humankind by Rutger Bregman. And, Bob, you mentioned that I seem optimistic, and I'm not optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic either. I think that there is an unknown future that we are on the cusp of, and that each one of us can, with our own way that we engage with the world, can help shift the way we want to go and who we want to be as human beings. And that's where I hold on to that hope that I can continue to not get sucked into despair, because it's really easy to do right now, especially with everything that's going on. And to be able to recognize, well, you know what, we're still here. And so what do we want to do with that? So, and then we're going to make history, because it's not the end of history.
Amen. And I mean, you bring up something that I wish we had dealt with more. Sometimes we only look at things pathologically. That's why I like humanistic psychology, because it looks at psychology from the end of what makes things go right, what constitutes healthiness. So that's a piece of our history we need to keep in mind too, and not just, we need to teach ourselves to love America, not in spite of our fallibility, but because of what we've learned from those fallibilities. Bob, final comments?
Well, I'll just say that I would urge our listeners to do anything they can to take a closer look at history. When you see talking heads on TV, listen to the historians, listen to the John Meachams, listen to the Doris Kearns Goodwins. These are people who have spent their lives looking at the patterns that we humans have engaged in throughout history. And we can really learn better ways to interpret what's going on today if we look at how those patterns have emerged over the course of time.
Amen. And the patterns are still emerging, which is a kind of a cool thing in my mind. And I don't think we have actually identified the final pattern because it's kaleidoscopic, perhaps. So, one of the things that drives me is we all come from our own myth. Now, I was brought up in the Judaic Christian tradition, and I realized as I was looking through some of my books in the library that I have a little thing with a C and a little cube by it, which means CCC. And in my mind, it means Church of Christian Consciousness, which is just my own little in my head way of seeing things. And most of my metaphysic and my journey kind of fits within this, and you've heard bits and pieces of it. So next week, I'm going to kind of get a little personal on you and throw some stuff at my cohorts here about the Church of Christian Consciousness, which is probably closer to Taoism than anything else when I really compare them, when I think of what the Christ movement is, which is analogous, and a synonym is the Tao in my mind. So I hope you'll join us when we look at a consciousness view from a boy who was brought up as a Christian and realized he was a mystic and still finds my roots in Jesus, but also finds my head and my heart with the Buddha, with Arjuna, and with Buffalo Woman. God's peace, my friends. God's peace.